Good afternoon. We would like to welcome you to the 2024 Constitution Day events. We appreciate your attendance in celebrating this treasure-founding documents. Next week's forum will be given by David French, a current opinion columnist for the New York Times, a Bronze Star recipient, and a former litigator who spent his career defending free speech, religious freedom, and due process. We encourage all of you to attend. We will begin this event with a prayer by Meredith Carroll, a senior majoring in social science teaching. Thank you, Meredith. We want to thank the sponsors of this event, the J. Reuben Park Law School, the School of Family, Home, and Social Science, and the Wheatley Institute. And in fact, on this event, it was an essay contest, and we have two members of our committee who read essays in the audience. I'd like Professor Cruson and Professor Breeder, if you could just stand up and wave. They were two of the 5 people that read. Yes, they deserve that. We appreciate them being here and supporting this cause. The Constitution Day Committee was impressed with the stellar essays it received this year, but only had time to recognize the top 3 winners, who received a financial stipend and a certificate from the Wheatley Institute. So thank you to the Wheatley for their sponsorship. And we would like to thank them for their generosity and support. Before we begin the actual readings, we would like to turn some time over to Professor Wheatley Rivero from the J. Reuben Law School, J. Reuben Clark Law School, and a Wheatley Constitutional Fellow. He will be giving some short remarks about the Constitution. Then after that, we will go in order of our 3rd to 1st place winners. So we will first hear from Abigail Bradshaw, 3rd place winner in the Constitution Day contest, with remarks by Dr. Rivero. Then we'll move to Jacob Boyer, our 2nd place winner in the Constitution Day event essay contest, and with remarks by Dr. Rivero. And then we'll conclude with Thomas Benfield, our winner this year in the Constitution Day event essay contest. At the conclusion of that, Dr. Rivero will make some remarks, and then the event will end at that time. We thank you all for your attendance. And before we do that, I'm just going to hand these certificates from the Wheatleys.
Oh, it's helpful. Yeah, this is helpful. That way I don't have to shout and scream. Okay. I think in some respects that's true, but I think we need to take stock of what exactly was happening in that antebellum period and what's different between today and the past. Again, I'll leave today to them, but I'm going to speak about the past. Okay. So this all starts, frankly, from the ratification, the framing and ratification of the Constitution itself. And there's really only one question, right, that comes to mind when it comes to polarization and potentially intransferable positions on the Constitution. And that's the question of slavery, right? What posture or position does the Constitution have towards slavery? Is it anti-slavery or is it pro-slavery? This was the question, right, that preoccupied the minds of every American. The way one historian wrote, he said, literally in that time, everything became a constitutional question. The reason why everything became a constitutional question is because everything seemed to hinge or fall on the question of slavery itself, right? And as it related to the Constitution. But how did we get there? It seems like we had something of a compromise, right? In 1787, it seems like the states were more or less willing to abide one another, particularly in the North and the South. But this is in part because, at least at the time of the ratification, all but I think one state practiced slavery in some way, or at least permitted slavery in some way. So this wasn't really a question, right? But over time, the anti-slavery movement grows and grows in the North, and then we have a political problem, right? There's an intransigence between the North, free states, and Southern slave states. But there's several compromises along the way, right, that can sort of serve as a patchwork. First, you have the Missouri Compromise of 1820, right? This sort of set up what some of you might have heard of as the Mason-Dixon line, essentially making it so that any new territories that were coming into the state north of this Mason-Dixon line would be free, and those from south of this border would be a slave state. The reason why it was important to set up free versus slave states was because of representation, right? The very premises of the 1787 Constitution. And this is mostly felt, frankly, in the South, right? As the nation continues to push westward, freedom is much more pushed much more so, right, than slavery interests. And so slave owners, in order to make sure that they had adequate representation in Congress, wanted to make sure that there continued to be slave states. The 1820 compromise lasts for some time until, again, we need another compromise in 1850. And this compromise was fundamentally pro-slavery, in part because at this time the southern slaveholding states more or less had control of the federal government, almost every single aspect of it. If you look at Congress, look at the presidency, you look at the courts, almost all of these representatives were more or less made up from the South, right? And so they were protecting slaveholding interests. But something started to change, right? The population began to grow more and more in the North, which, along with that, a stronger and stronger anti-slavery sentiment, right? And then suddenly, by 1856 and then by 1860, you finally have what's the Republican Party, which I'm sure you all have heard of. This is the first anti-slavery party ever established, right, in America that has real political sway. You had political parties before then, but they didn't really have any sort of political power or political will. For instance, like the Liberty Party, I think they got something like 1% of the national vote, right? But then the Republican Party suddenly in 1856 is viable, right? They're winning elections in the North. And then comes along a candidate, which some of you may have heard of. His name is Abraham Lincoln. He's the first one to write a ticket that actually wins, right, in the North. But what's the state of politics, right? What's the state of polarization? And was the Constitution able to resolve some of these things? In some respects, yes, the Constitution was able to resolve it because it set up an electoral college, right? And it set up matters of representation, which the South, at least up until 1856, enjoyed in all of its glory, right? They had more or less all power. But then suddenly, when anti-slavery sentiment was strong enough that it suddenly had the bulk of political power, then you ask yourself, well, is the Constitution enough to keep the Union together? We all know what happened in 1860, right? The firing on Fort Sumter, southern slaveholding states decided we want no union, right, with the North because they felt betrayed in some way. But when you look underneath the hood, what actually happened, they finally lost power in the federal government, and they would not have that. So does the Constitution actually say this? If you take a Lincolnian position, which I think a lot of these essays do, the answer has to be yes, right? Because what was Lincoln's position on this question? His position wasn't suddenly we've lost the Constitution. People have seceded. No, the Constitution always remained, right? The Union represented, right, legitimately represented, right, the many states of America. And even though it took a civil war to keep the Union together, it was held together, right? And after that, several amendments were proposed, agreed upon, and ratified, right? Which has held the Union for almost, over 100 years, right? We're not that far away, right, from 200 years in the Civil War. So in some respects, you have to say that the Constitution was a success. And then, again, I'm going to leave today for them to think about. But when we think about the past, when we think about slavery and how intransable that position is, either you're pro-slavery or you're anti-slavery. There was no middle ground on this question. Even though some Northerners tried to have a middle ground, eventually everyone sort of fell in one camp or another. The Constitution survived, right? And I guess that's sort of my takeaway. We're going to learn some interesting aspects for today, some interesting proposals for today. But I think at the end of the day, we should remember that the Constitution did survive even such, let's say, a monumentous occasion, such as the Civil War. So with that, I'll just end my comments there. Maybe you can percolate a little bit about the Civil War, have that in your mind, but we'll turn the time over to Abigail, right?
My high school was not a perfect institution by any means, but its motto was flawless. Excellence our tradition, diversity our strength. This was, of course, often more of an ideal than a reality for Sparkham High. It is nevertheless a powerful and beautiful ideal. Even more than to my school, I feel that it ought to apply to my nation. The United States of America. Excellence our tradition, diversity our strength. Of course, the United States doesn't have a perfect track record for producing excellence either. Our history is full of great successes, but also great oppressions and great atrocities. Often, all three can be found tied up in the same historical event. Too many times, our failures at excellence have been, at their root, failures to make diversity our strength. One such failure lies in the very system by which we elect our governing body. The electoral tradition and laws of the United States are designed, whether intentionally or not, to create and perpetuate a two-party system. It's worth pointing out here that the two-party system is by no means completely dysfunctional. It's gotten us this far, but it does have dysfunctions. One of those dysfunctions is polarization. Polarization is a major concern in the United States right now. Political polarization eats away at unity and civility. It feeds an us versus them mentality, which in turn fuels hate, fear, and vitriol. Polarization is defined as the accentuation of a difference between two things or groups, or a division into two sharply contrasting groups or sets of beliefs or opinions. The most frightening word in that definition to me is division. Divided, we are weak, angry, and lonely. We lose the collaborative power, strength, and society we might have had. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. He understood more than most how much we had to fear in division. Diversity is not division. Like any marvelous thing that can be turned to evil ends, it can be used to fuel division, but just as my high school motto taught, diversity can be a strength. The problem with the two-party system is not that there are two parties instead of one, it is that there are two parties instead of several. As the citizens of the United States pull further and further into two antagonistic groups, people put themselves into two camps because there are only two camps to choose from. There's an us and a them. No allies, no neutral ground, only an enemy. If we truly fear division, a binary system cannot be our choice. Neither can a unitary system. Conformity is not unity. What we need is more specific and differentiated representation than our current system can provide. There are various means to accomplish this, but I recommend specific reforms to the manner in which we elect representatives, senators, and the president, in order to facilitate the creation and perpetuation of additional parties. Biggest changes would be in how we elect the House of Representatives. Currently, a certain number of representatives are allotted to each state, and those representatives are elected via single-member districts. This winner-take-all method favors the two-party system, making it extremely difficult for even a third party, let alone a fourth party, to successfully elect a representative to the House. This could be changed by amending the Constitution to create a system of proportional representation. Specifically, elections to the House could be nationalized, with the United States divided by population into 87 geographically continuous 5-member districts, still totaling 435 members of the House. The powers and responsibilities of redistricting and holding and paying for elections would be national. Elections would utilize an open list system, where voters elect their preferred candidate from lists provided by the different parties. Seats are given to the party based on the votes their candidates received, and then allotted to candidates within the party based on the votes each candidate received. The goal of such a change would be to facilitate the creation of more political parties, enabling more exact representation and decreasing polarization. If more than one person can win the election, strategies change. In a winner-take-all system, voters are incentivized to vote for the candidate they like the best that also has the best chance of winning, not necessarily the candidate that they like the best overall. While that strategy will still exist to some extent, multi-member districts increase the chances of winning for more candidates, making more candidates viable options. As Grant Tudor and Baud Cartier argue in their article, Proportional Representation for the United States, under proportional rules, the door would open for new parties to form and realistically contest seats. The results would be greater enfranchisement for people that aren't represented by the current system, whether through the creation of new parties that better match their needs, or the possibility of their already existing party winning seats in an area where it would have been nearly impossible under a winner-take-all system. Proportional representation and the additional parties it enables will better reflect the full spectrum of ideologies and interests of the American people. Simply representing that spectrum, having more than two sides, can mitigate the effects of polarization. Certainly, there will still be competition. Elections will still be contests between different candidates and parties, in some ways even more so than under our current system. However, with more parties, even if a win for someone else is a loss for you, which is less likely to get a case of proportional representation, the fact that there can be parties or candidates outside your own that you would rather win than others makes for a more united and less polarized system. The outlook is less binary, less us versus them. There can be allies, not just a single perceived enemy. Nationalizing the House of Representatives is a major break from the traditional federalist system of the United States. One potential danger is that it provides less representation to states, particularly to those with very small populations. This fear echoes the original fear over the structure of the House that our founders debated, that states with small populations would be completely overruled by states with large populations. Their solution? A the Senate. The Senate would consist of 2 senators from each state, each with an equal vote. They went so far as to make the only aspect of government that they granted indefinite immunity from amendment, that no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. The Senate provides a similar solution in this instance. Senators would maintain their geographic ties to individual states, but the Constitution would be amended to mandate that senators be elected via ranked choice voting. Additionally, senatorial terms would be decreased to a length of 3 years, with elections rotating through the Senate every year, rather than every 2 years. The traditional nature of the Senate would ensure that states with fewer representatives in the House, or no representatives speaking specifically for their state, would still have direct representation in the legislature. Decreased term lengths would increase candidates' accountability to their state-based constituencies. Using a ranked choice voting system would perpetuate the benefits of proportional representation in the House by enabling the success of a greater number of political parties in Senate races. One major fear that people have with voting for a third-party candidate in a two-party system is that they are effectively throwing away their vote or using it on the candidate they use in court. The company Rigged Vote explains this benefit of ranked choice voting this way. Voters no longer have to play pundit in voting, gaming out who is the most electable and then strategically voting for that candidate. Instead, voters rank their most preferred candidate without fear of wasting your vote. There's no penalty for voting for whom you believe in, even if that candidate is not the most likely to win. Ranked choice voting for senators would support the multi-party system created by proportional representation in the House of Representatives and perpetuate its benefits. Following the same logic, the only change to presidential elections would be an amendment mandating that popular presidential elections utilize ranked choice voting. It would be possible here to use a proportional system to determine electors. Maine and Nebraska already do. But because the presidential contest is ultimately a winner-take-all contest, I believe that implementing ranked choice voting provides the best possibility of a system that allows for more than 2 successful parties. What I have proposed here are changes to the Constitution, to the systems that it created. These changes, while alterations to its letter, are not alterations to its usage. The preamble to the Constitution lists among several purposes the intentions to form a more perfect union, ensure domestic tranquility, and promote the general welfare. Polarization and the division it produces are contrary to these intentions. The solution lies in reflecting America's diversity into its government. The people of the United States populate the entire political spectrum. Our current parties fail to represent that. In failing, they create 2 enemy camps, us and them. If we are to form a more perfect union, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and ultimately, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, we must create a system that makes diversity our strength.
Okay, thank you, Abigail. So I think it's great that in some respects we start up with what I think was maybe the most provocative essay, or at least the most provocative suggestions, right, or measures. So first I'll just sort of summarize what those measures are, and then I'll give some comments on them. So one, I think perhaps most interesting is this idea of like nationalized House elections, right, based on proportional voting. And then there's a sense of, okay, now we've made nationalized House elections, proportional voting. In my mind, okay, we're trying to increase, let's say, the democratic nature itself of voting and for our representatives. So why not do the same thing for the Senate, for instance, right? So then we reduce Senate's terms in half, right, limiting it to 3 years. And we have this question of ranked voting, or this tie to ranked voting. I'll say something on that in a minute. And then also ranked voting for presidential voting for the Electoral College, if I understood that correctly. Okay, so I think these are interesting and quite bold suggestions. And in a lot of ways, it would completely change the landscape of how politics are done in the U.S. I'm no expert on European politics, but it seems like, if anything, we'd be mirroring a little bit more our neighbors across the pond, right, and how elections are done. So in one respect, I guess the question you sort of have to ask ourselves is, would more democracy in this way promote, or would it decrease polarization, right? Because you have to think about, like, what are the roles of the parties themselves? At least there's one theory that supposes that the parties themselves are used to sort of, let's say, bring people closer to a center, even if maybe they are polarized from each other, and perhaps maybe like unleashing people from, this two-party system, does it actually give them the opportunity to then, let's say, fully embrace their more partisan or ideologically extreme positions, right? As opposed to having to join with a party in which they have to reconcile their own differences, because even if there's an us and them within the party, there is also an us and them, right? So maybe as you continue to reflect on this essay and maybe build it out into something more, that could be something to think about. And then the proportional voting, I think, if anything, I think this is possibly the most interesting idea coming out of this essay. Yeah, what might that actually look like, right? What would the different parties be? Can we get a sense of that right now, right? There's like I know there's sort of some libertarian strains that feel like they have to make certain compromises with either the left or the right. Maybe they can make their own party, as it were, which is some weird marriage between left and right. And maybe that could help with the polarization problem, right? Because then suddenly you have someone that's sort of in the middle that's actually steering away more voters, and maybe that'll actually have to make Republicans and Democrats have to come closer to a more moderate center. Who knows, right? But that could be something to think about. And then how does this relate to the Constitution itself? I think you're right? Would these proposals violate any provision of the Constitution? I don't know that it would. The Senate question is probably the closest, but even then, like as long as there are two representatives from the Senate, right, then I don't know that it would violate the Constitution. Which raises the question of, okay, again, the Senate halving their terms. It seems to be like a sort of democratic move, right? Instead of the framers, who I think their sense was, well, we want people who are more removed from the people, who we can deliberate more. We can always decide whether our Senate is actually doing that. Are they deliberating more and better than the House? That's always an open question, right? But as we decrease their terms to 3 years, then the question is like, well, what's the functional difference, right, between the Senate and the House? And it raises some interesting questions there. Let's see. And then the last thing on Senate, like ranked voting, I wonder, would it actually change anything, right? If we have two dominant parties, maybe there's some distant future where the Democrats and Republicans aren't actually dominating, but in a Senate race, I don't know how much ranked voting is going to accomplish. It might accomplish something, right? Maybe we'll get, one Republican and one Democrat when we would have gotten two Democrats. But my assumption is it probably would stay more or less the same, even with ranked voting. While with like presidential voting, and especially the Electoral College and how that works, does ranked voting, would that matter in some regard, right? So all of a sudden, and then you tie that to the proportion of electoral votes a president gets, for instance, right? So a Republican state, right? Normally you win or take all, you get all the votes. But let's just say you tie ranked voting with proportionality. Suddenly you have some other candidates who are pulling enough of percentage of the vote that they're losing 1, 2, or 3 electoral college votes, right? So that might be something to think about. Anyways, I want to keep my comments brief, but again, I think this was a very provocative essay with provocative suggestions, some of which I think might not change much, but other things which I think you should consider because it could deeply and vastly change, right, the political landscape. And I think there's some there would be the way to put it. So well done, and thank you for your essay.
The Constitution of the United States of America is one of the most inspired political documents in history. The framers of the Constitution identified ideas such as self-government, natural rights, and the rule of law as the foundation of a just nation. And yet, despite their confidence in these core principles, the framers also knew that the implementation would need to be improved as the nation grew. To facilitate this growth, the framers included a means by which the Constitution could be amended. Now, more than 200 years and 27 amendments later, another amendment may be necessary so that the nation can move forward in unity. The First Amendment to the Constitution all but guarantees disagreement. This is by design, as the freedoms of speech and expression allow citizens and politicians alike to discuss a variety of solutions to contemporary problems. However, despite the plethora of opinions inherent to the marketplace of ideas, the government is dominated by only two major parties. At all levels of government, the electorate seems to be faced with a limited choice between the Republican and Democratic parties. In fact, all 50 state governors are currently members of the two major parties, and every president since Lincoln has been either a Republican or a Democrat. The major parties even dominate at the municipal level, with 89 of the 100 largest cities in the U.S. being governed by the two major parties, and only one being governed by a member of a third party. At the same time, any casual observer can see that political discourse has become incredibly polarized. When two parties hold nearly all of the political power and the citizenry finds itself increasingly divided, it seems reasonable to connect the two-party system to the division. Nevertheless, before an adequate solution can be discussed, it would be wise to consider whether the two-party system is really the root cause of the recent political contention. In software troubleshooting, there is an idea called the XY problem, which is the tendency of a client to ask questions that focus on their proposed solution, X, rather than addressing the actual problem, Y. The XY problem can lead to wild goose chases and wasted time if X doesn't actually solve Y. The solution to this habit is to methodically evaluate the system, testing changes and observing the performance to find the true cause of the problem. With this idea in mind, it may be a good idea to take a step back and evaluate whether focusing on the two-party system is an instance of the XY problem. Modern political polarization seems to be increasing at an alarming rate. However, it wasn't at this rate until relatively recently. A study by the Pew Research Center shows that measured party polarization remained largely unchanged from 1994 to 2004. Yet from 2004 to 2017, the polarization among both the general public and the politically engaged increased dramatically. It is easy to see that this trend has continued beyond 2017, with the destructive Black Lives Matter riots of 2020 and the controversial January 6th Capitol riot of 2021. In contrast to the recent political polarization, the two-party system is nearly as old as the nation itself. The first partisan divisions appeared in the early 1790s over federalism and Alexander Hamilton's fiscal policy as the Secretary of the Treasury. Since then, the presidency, the Senate, and the House of Representatives have been predominantly controlled by varying combinations of two opposing parties. Yet while the presence of the two-party system remains constant through American history, the actual magnitude of political strife ebbs and flows as the national debate shifts from one issue to another. Another reason to doubt that the two-party system is the root cause of modern polarization is the context of the Civil War. The war came about amid fractured parties, a four-way presidential election, and an ideological fissure between the North and South. The worst political violence in U.S. history occurred not along party lines, but along cultural and geographical lines. The existence of more than two parties at this time in history indicates that certain types of polarization occur beyond the context of the political system. A brief evaluation of the causes of the Civil War may aid in understanding whether today's political issues are of a similar nature. It is common knowledge that the Civil War was ultimately fought over the issue of slavery. Many contentions had come and gone over the short history of the U.S. to that point, but the debate over slavery was unique. Where previous issues such as federalism, taxes, and spending were more spectral and thus more conducive to compromise, the issue of slavery was binary. It was either right to hold slaves or it was not, and therefore more divisive. The absence of a middle ground between the two opinions prevented compromise, especially when it was seen as an issue of morality. Attempts at compromise, such as the Missouri Compromise of 1820, ultimately proved ineffective at relieving contention, as seen in the violence of the Bleeding Kansas conflict in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This inability to compromise on the issue led to secession and civil war when neither side was willing to yield their sense of morality to the other. In resolving modern topics of polarization, it is important to consider whether the most divisive issues are also binary moral questions if adequate solutions are to be found. Though it is not an officially Christian nation, the United States was founded upon liberal Christian principles. Universally shared religious and philosophical traditions allowed for a shared national morality upon which to build a society. Today, the United States remains a majority Christian nation, but the proportion of citizens who identify as having no religion at all is now at roughly 3 in 10. The fact that the proportion of a-religious Americans has doubled since 2007 indicates a possible relationship between the growing religious divide and increasing political tensions. The modern diversity in religious views shows that the Constitution has been successful in fostering a space in which individuals are free to worship as they will. Unfortunately, a natural side effect of this increase in diversity is less agreement on the underlying morals upon which the law and government are based. The United States is unique in that Americans are not defined by a nationality or ethnicity. Instead, Americans can be defined by the principles and ideals they collectively hold. As a result, disagreement over what the core principles ought to be must necessarily lead to a deep division within the American people. As seen in the aforementioned statistics on religion, one of the central disagreements among Americans is the existence of God. Due to the Christian foundation upon which the nation was created, such a disagreement has the potential to undermine the Constitution at its core. For example, the belief that humans are made in the image of God underlies the principle of equality and human dignity. Remove the Christian belief, and suddenly the assumption of the equality of all mankind is in need of alternative justification. As America finds itself increasingly divided over this core moral belief, the disagreement has cascaded to several other moral issues such as abortion, sexuality, gender identities, and race relations. If today's foremost debates are moral questions with little room for compromise, then it is unlikely that an adjustment of the political system would prevent the future increase in political contention in America. Such a solution is like trying to close a wound without first cleaning it. Healing might initially appear like a mirage, but festering would continue beneath the surface. In other words, focusing on the two-party system rather than the fundamental divisions in religion, philosophy, and political beliefs among the American people is an instance of the XY problem. While amending the two-party system may not be the solution, it is still possible to resolve the polarization in America. The Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, is designed to give ultimate power to the people of the United States. This is likely why John Adams wrote, quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The abandonment of founding constitutional principles by the American people renders the document powerless to govern them as its underlying assumptions of civic virtue crumble. Therefore, the solution to the moral and political polarization of the people is not an amendment to the Constitution, but an amendment of the citizens themselves. Thomas Sowell once said, quote, "The only way the Constitution can protect us is if we protect the Constitution," close quote. We must do so not through political violence or social pressure, but by living the principles on which the nation was founded. Availing ourselves of the First Amendment, we can convince our fellow countrymen through words and deeds, demonstrating the good fruits of liberty, equality, justice, virtue, self-government, and faith in our Creator. The United States has stood as a city on a hill for over 200 years. If we are to save this legacy, we must do so from the ground up, not the top down. Let us build principled communities in our towns and in our cities, so that they may shine as beacons to our nation. Then, when we have taught ourselves what the framers knew to be self-evident, let us invite our countrymen to adopt those same principles and live in liberty and the pursuit of true happiness. In a nation of hundreds of millions, there will always be disagreement and opportunists who leverage it for political power. But let us unite in the basic fundamental beliefs that first united the states under the Constitution. Let us agree that life is sacred, that liberty is essential to the pursuit of happiness, and that all men and women truly are created equal. Only then will we be able to leverage the Constitution in confronting the challenges of this world as one nation under God. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jacob, for your essay, for your comments. So yeah, the XY thesis, I never heard. I'm a law professor. Obviously, I'd never heard of the XY thesis before, but it makes sense, right? So to summarize, right, the XY thesis as it relates to the polarization issue. Well, it's not the parties, which is X, right? It's the people, Y, right? That is the problem. And I like this part in your essay. You say something to the effect of, well, there's no need to amend the Constitution. You just have to amend the people, right? Which I think is interesting. And how would we amend them? As I take it from your essay, it's going back to like Imago Dei, right? The image of God, right, is where we need to return to. The image of God and as a basis for human dignity, right, and equality. And I think that's a strong argument, right? The idea that we've always had parties, so what's different, right? It's not the parties, it's the people that are different now. And as an answer, right, you say, well, ultimately, it's changing hearts and minds, which kind of actually pointing to the Constitution to be like the First Amendment, right? This idea, well, as long as we have freedom of speech, then we can always, solve this issue. And so I think there's some great things there, especially this idea of the underlying philosophical justifications for our rights, right, as human beings, and for the dignity that we have. What does that dignity entail? What does equality entail? If we might go back actually to the Civil War period, and especially the arguments against slavery, it's interesting, right? This question of religion, right? Like image of God and human dignity. Now, interestingly, during the antebellum period, they also used a lot of religious rhetoric. In fact, Abraham Lincoln did as well. But it wasn't always in relation to the Christian religion. They always referred to the Declaration, right? And to put it one way, so Frederick Douglass, who I writing a book on him, he's a great person. You should read, his autobiography as well as any other writing you can get from him. But the way that he put it was the Declaration is our civic catechism, right? It's very like Catholic way of putting it, right? But it's this idea that like, well, where do our religious sentiments come from? For Douglass, for Lincoln, for a lot of other anti-slavery Republicans, it was the Declaration. Like that was our civic religion, as it were. And obviously that's borrowing, right, from Judeo-Christian principles, but maybe a recovery of that language, a recovery of that sense of our belonging and identity. It's not that you have to be Christian, right, to belong in the nation, but no, you have to sign on to our nation's creed, which is the Declaration of Independence, right? That's the nation's creed. So I think that's one interesting point. Maybe one thing to think more about is how, nevertheless, despite the Constitution not necessarily being the problem, we still need to think through, can the Constitution save our particular moment, right? You mentioned the question over slavery and the issues of compromise, but maybe what was glossed over a little bit more was it was actually the very nature of the Constitution itself that helped to breed the violence and create the high stakes, right? You mentioned bleeding Kansas, right, as one example. Well, why was it they're bleeding Kansas? It's because Southern slave owners, as well as let's say anti-slavery advocates, were pouring into Kansas and fighting over what? Whether Kansas would be a slave or a free state. And why were they doing that? Because of federalism itself, right? The very terms and grounds upon which the Constitution framed this form of government in some ways actually augmented, right, and exacerbated the violence because so much was at stake. So that's something to maybe just think about and grapple with as you think more about this essay. But on the whole, I really love the essay, especially this idea of going back to, I guess you meant to some, but maybe our Christian roots. And I would say yes, but maybe even more so like our civic religious roots, which is the Declaration of Independence itself. So thank you.
I was kind of nervous I was going to drop my laptop and walk over. But I'm excited to read my essay. The title is The Constitution's Defense Against Polarization. The year was 1787, and the United States of America was ascending into political dysfunction, troubled by a failing constitution. James Madison memorialized the moment, noting, "Complaints are everywhere heard that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties." Madison's words resonate all too well in the present era of American politics. Is the Constitution bound for a similar fate as the Articles of Confederation, cast down by an inability to mitigate the conflict between competing interests and parties? Are amendments required to ensure the Constitution's survival in today's polarized climate? Madison answers, "In the extent and proper structure of the Union, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to the Republic endeavor." The Constitution, in its current form, is sufficient to combat the effects posed by increasing political polarization. Rising levels of political polarization exacerbate all three major threats to the Constitution: foreign influence, civil war, and authoritarian rule. However, the Constitution's basic structure provides a feasible path forward. The separation of powers with the resilient and adaptable system of checks and balances, and the electorally accountable representative democracy outlined in the Constitution can serve the interests of a divided country without falling prey to any of the major constitutional threats. In this essay, I will show how the Constitution provides sufficient protection, or allows for sufficient reform to protect against the three major constitutional threats, while providing historical evidence that the Constitution's weaknesses are not sufficient to spell its demise. Though Congress is increasingly trapped in partisan conflicts, national security remains one of the few areas of effective leadership. Prominent among the Constitution's chief goals
was establishing a union with enough power to protect the states from foreign invaders. Government shutdowns, often a failure to compromise on a single issue, hamper the nation's long-term readiness. Political priorities seemingly shift every election cycle, resulting in unfocused objectives. However, as recently as 2022, two politically divided chambers worked together to increase defense spending by 8%. Even in an era of intense polarization, both parties have continued to prioritize the congressional duty to raise and support the military, ensuring foreign invasion was as little threat to the Constitution. The Constitution is also unlikely to face crisis from less direct methods of foreign influence. Foreign interference in election could pose a threat to the survival of American democracy. The modern media landscape and the influence of money in politics, supercharged by polarization, provide potential channels for foreign actors to manipulate American democracy. Interference in American elections has already caused some to question the legitimacy of elections. However, evidence shows that interference built on polarization fails to meaningfully affect voter behavior. The Constitution is also protected from foreign influence on politicians through the Emoluments Clause. The lack of significant capabilities to influence voter opinion, combined with protection against foreign political corruption, suggests that non-militaristic foreign influence is unlikely to cause a constitutional crisis by leveraging polarization. Modern polarization leading to civil war is a direct threat to the Constitution's survival. Scholars suggest that modern polarization is surpassed only by the era preceding the Civil War. Both voters and their representatives are becoming more polarized, following parties incentivized to align on opposite sides of virtually every issue. As tensions rise, the effectiveness of government decreases, leading to a decrease in trust. However, the Constitution provides a workable framework to temper competing interests and reform distorted incentives. The founders wrote the Constitution knowing that citizens would disagree, even violently, over political issues. Focused on limiting the effects of polarization rather than removing its causes, the framers designed a democracy with Republican controls. Each representative would serve a broad swath of constituents, ensuring small interests would not hold representatives captive. Yet the major parties, primaries and caucuses, give outsized influence to the most polarized part of the electorate, failing to deliver candidates from the hold of small interests. These electoral tools, intended to increase democracy, instead fail to represent the majority interest from most communities. Further, geographical sorting had led to an electoral system in which most districts are dominated by one party. But solutions to these problems do not require constitutional amendments. States are finding new ways to elevate candidates that better represent the interests of their constituents, such as ranked choice voting. Indeed, the Constitution is necessarily silent on how parties select their candidates. The Constitution affords the freedoms of speech, association, and press required to foster positive partisanship, often to guarantee freedom and allow for innovation, an approach which has contributed to the Constitution's resilience. The frequency of elections also contributes to the defense against a polarized descent into violence. The losing party is incentivized to compete in the next election instead of throwing in resources at a war to destroy the system. Finally, the striking difference between polarization of today and the polarization of the Civil War is its cause. In the Civil War, the dispute over the constitutional endorsement of slavery proved irreconcilable. Today's dispute centers on the Constitution's meaning rather than on its content. Bolstering support for the Constitution as each party builds their case on constitutional principles. The Constitution is equipped to handle the threat of an authoritarian ruler, even when heightened by polarization. The founders dreaded any form of American monarchy and accordingly designed the Constitution to disarm any aspiring despots played for power. The disarmament's central feature was the separation of powers between three branches of government accompanied by a system of checks and balances. Polarization has eroded the separation of powers as presidents fatigue the logjam legislature test the limits of their express and implicit powers. The judicial branch's legitimacy faces questions due to a partisan nomination process and decisions that frequently align with justices' supposed political ideology. Further, an increase in polarization leaves parties liable to pursue authoritarian domination over the other. However, the system of checks and balances combined with institutional capital, is sufficiently robust to prevent the rise of an authoritarian leader. The constitutional checks and balances were primarily focused on checking the legislature, and polarization has only increased their efficacy. The legislature is frequently unable to wield its own express powers when the chambers are controlled by two different parties. The split legislature, originally designed to balance the popular House and the more Republican Senate, has instead turned into a gauntlet of political polarization. Consequently, the legislature has allowed the president to slowly accumulate power, escalating the risk of a successful authoritarian power grab. In response, the remaining checks and balances contained in the judiciary and the states has successfully prevented the president from exercising absolute power. Courts have repeatedly cracked down on questionable exercises of presidential power. Further, states have successfully protested and defied federal direction. The Constitution's checks and balances provide a system adaptable to a polarized climate, ensuring that when one branch is weak, another can aggressively check. Another check developed over the past 2 centuries serves as a significant roadblock: institutional capital. The founders understood that the Constitution would need to be tried by experience. Never had such a large state attempted such a democratic republic. Over the years, numerous obstacles to constitutional breaches have been constructed: a large civil service, an expansive and nonpartisan military, and a robust opposition party stand ready to oppose any would-be tyrant. In today's extreme polarization, any authoritarian president can expect fierce institutional opposition at every turn. Though not written in the Constitution, these institutions were built to serve the interests of the Union, becoming indispensable instruments for the Constitution's protection. Several crises in recent history could have devolved into constitutional crises, yet in each event, the Constitution is uniformly upheld. In the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton lost the Electoral College despite winning the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. Further, reports of Russian election interference suggested foreign influence might have swayed the election to Donald Trump. The Electoral College has long been a potential flashpoint for a constitutional crisis, and the 2016 election was a perfect storm: a large disparity between the electoral and popular votes, the victory of a deeply controversial candidate, a highly polarized climate, and questions over the legitimacy of the election. However, the losing party accepted the results. Both parties knew the rules before the election and abided in victory or defeat. 4 polarizing years later, the incumbent president proceeded on a campaign to prove the election illegitimate after losing the popular and electoral votes. This presented a clear constitutional crisis: an incumbent president determined to remain in office, an angry base of loyal supporters, and the cooperation of some elected officials. In this case, a judiciary committed to the rule of law, together with a few elected officials who defied partisan interests, successfully thwarted threats against the Constitution. In both crises, the Constitution's basic structure, combined with institutional capital, built sense ratification to succeeded in quelling threats against the Constitution. The story of the Constitution of the United States is not over. Indeed, the founders felt it was a lifeless text, unless citizens of the states breathed vitality into it. Throughout American history, citizens have met the challenge defending and reforming the Constitution, both blood and being. Their efforts have ensured the Constitution remained a steady bulwark against the increasingly stormy seas of polarization. As America strives for a better future, may we look to the parting words of President Washington: "Is there a doubt whether a common government can embrace so large a sphere? Let experience solve it." Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, for that wonderful essay, and I'll keep my comments brief so that we get out on time. The main thrust, right? The Constitution essentially prevents polarization's effects, right, in 3 particular areas, right? Foreign influence, civil war, and authoritarian rule. Okay, so I'll just have like a very brief comment on each. So as far as the foreign influence, despite polarization, the argument is, well, bipartisan efforts are still it's working out, right? I mean, in foreign affairs, right, there seems to be more or less a bipartisan thrust to continue to carry out Congress's duties. Now, I mean, I think the the initial question that raises, though, what if that doesn't happen, right? What does the Constitution provide? That's something to think about, I think, because right now I think we can rely on that. Well, things are fine right now, but what happens when they're not, right? And that's something to think about. And then the Civil War, yeah, I mean, in some respects, I mean, January 6th is a good example of how, yeah, there are a lot of mechanisms in place, and the Constitution is actually pretty well suited, right, to guard against these sorts of things, especially after the 14th Amendment was ratified. Now, the only thing I'll say here is you liken it to like the Civil War period in 1860 and saying, well, I mean, back then there was a question over the Constitution's content, right, not its meaning. Well, today it's just a question of meaning. But I would just challenge you to maybe look at some more sources, because it actually was over the meaning itself. I don't think anyone really disputed the content. It was like, what do these clauses mean? When Justice Taney says blacks can't be citizen, that was an interpretation of the Constitution's meaning, to which Abraham Lincoln says, you're wrong, and therefore I'm going to ignore the Dred Scott decision, right? So I think there was still a problem over meaning, but one thing to think about, does that matter, right? Or how does the Constitution nevertheless allow for debates around different understandings of its meaning, and yet we can continue to have sort of a cohesive nation? And then on the authoritarian, I think this is the best part of the piece, right? And particularly showing how checks and balances as well as federalism can help prevent sort of authoritarian from taking over. And then the only question I think you should think through there is, what happens when checks and balances don't work as well? Because the whole point of it was that there be ambition counteracting ambition. You mentioned like there's weak branches who help strong ones. I don't think that's how it was initially envisioned. I think it was envisioned, no, there are three strong branches who are all vying for power, and in as much as all three are doing so, then there will be a good balance. But what happens when one of those branches, like Congress, becomes relatively anemic, right? What can the Constitution do in those instances? But otherwise, again, fantastic essay. And thank you to all three of our contestants again, and we hope you have a great day.